My name is Mariah from Brazil, and I will continue telling my story. Have you ever tasted your own heart? Not the organ itself, but the panic it pumps through your body when you're trying to breathe in a room where the air doesn't belong to you. It tastes like metal, like you've been sucking on a copper coin, or like you just bit your tongue, and the copper temps of blood is spreading across your teeth. It's the flavor of fear, and in the house of the man my father chose for me, that taste became my breakfast, my lunch, and my dinner. I didn't say yes, but no one cared. And now, I was living in a house that felt like a museum, where I was the only exhibit not allowed to be touched. People imagine that being taken care of by a man with money and land is a dream come true. They imagine soft sheets and full plates, but they don't tell you about the silence. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, like a Sunday afternoon in a hammock. No, this was the kind of silence that sits in your mouth, heavy, sharp, and completely unswallowed. It was a silence that had teeth. The first time I really noticed it, I was sitting at his table, Manuel, my husband. Even saying the word husband felt like wearing a coat that was 4 sizes too big for me. It felt borrowed, heavy, and itchy. His house was different from my father's. My father's house was chaotic, dusty, and loud, with the sounds of a man who ruled with his boots. Manuel's house was structured. It was clean. It was ordered in a way that felt aggressive. Everything had a place. The forks were aligned on the table with such precision you'd think they were soldiers standing at attention for a general. Even the air seemed to know it wasn't supposed to move too much. He liked things aligned. He believed that structure created peace, or at least that's what he told me. But I quickly realized that his peace was just a polite word for my total disappearance. I remember the sound of my chair legs scraping against the floor as I sat down for dinner. It was a normal sound, right? But in that house, it sounded like a gunshot. It was too loud. Everything was too loud. The ticking of the clock on the wall felt like a hammer. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like a low-level scream. Even my own breathing felt like I was being a nuisance. Manuel didn't yell. That was the trick of it. He didn't slam his hand on the table or throw plates like the men in the stories people tell. He just watched. There is something about being watched in total silence that completely rearranges your nervous system. It makes you feel like you're a bug under a magnifying glass, waiting for the sun to hit the lens just right so you'll burst into flames. I reached for my glass of water, and my hand trembled just a tiny, microscopic shake. I prayed to God he wouldn't see it. I squeezed the glass so hard my knuckles turned white. But he noticed. He always noticed. "You're nervous," he said. He didn't ask it. He stated it. It was an observation, as cold and clinical as a doctor diagnosing a fever. I tried to smile. I tried to use that old Maria charm, the one that used to make the neighbors laugh. "I'm just adjusting," I said. Adjusting. What a nice, polite word for being ripped out of your life and dropped into a cage. He just nodded once, his eyes never leaving mine. Then, he reached over and moved my plate. It was off by maybe half an inch. He corrected the position until it was perfectly aligned with the edge of the table. "Things work better when they are where they belong," he said. I swallowed hard, and that's when the metal taste hit me. It was sharp, instant. It felt like I had bitten my own tongue. No one tells you that fear is a physical thing you can taste. I realized that night that fear doesn't always come with a punch or a scream. Sometimes it arrives with order. Sometimes it arrives in a house where the towels are folded perfectly and the floor is always waxed. He asked me about my day, and I realized with a jolt of horror that I didn't have a day. I had a series of rooms. I had walls. I had the growing understanding that I was now a small gear in a massive, silent machine that I hadn't designed and couldn't stop. "I expect honesty," he told me that evening. I nodded, because that's what you do. But honesty felt like a death sentence, because if I were being honest, I would have said, "I want to scream until the windows shatter. I didn't choose you. I didn't choose this life. I am terrified of you, and I don't even know why yet, because you haven't even raised your voice." But in that house, neutrality was the only way to survive. If you didn't fight, you were stable. If you stayed quiet, you were respectful. So, I learned. I learned to speak less. I learned to observe the way the shadows moved across the floor. I learned to align myself to his expectations before he even had to speak them. The first real crack in the mask happened about 3 weeks into the marriage. It was such a small thing. If you were watching from the outside, you wouldn't have even seen it. We were sitting on the porch, and he mispronounced a word, some technical term about the cattle or the land. It was a funny mistake, and for a split second, the old Maria, the girl who laughed at the goat eating the neighbor's flowers, came back to life. I laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It wasn't mean. It was just a reflex. The air in the room didn't just get cold. It froze solid. The world stopped turning. Manuel didn't shout. He didn't move a muscle. He just looked at me as if I had walked into a church and started cursing. He looked at me like I was a broken piece of equipment. "What was that?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, my heart starting to do that panicked bird dance against my ribs. "I'm sorry. It was funny. I don't like being laughed at," he said. His voice was as flat as a grave. "I wasn't. You were." The metal taste flooded my mouth. It was so strong I thought I might gag. I realized in that moment that fear doesn't need to scream to control you. That night, I lay in bed and watched the moon through the window. The house was making those little settling noises, wood groaning, pipes whispering. Every single sound felt like it was being amplified by a microphone. I wondered if my father had ever felt this. Had he ever sat in a room where the very air felt like it was on a timer? He had talked about opportunity and responsibility when he sold me off. He never mentioned that I'd be living in a place where the atmosphere felt like a threat. There is a massive difference between being safe and being controlled. I was learning that lesson the hard way. Safety is when you can make a mistake and not feel like the world is going to end. Control is when a folded towel can become a reason for a 3-hour silence. He raised his voice for the first time a few days later, but again, it wasn't a yell. It was just precise. I had folded the towels the way my mother taught me, in thirds. He liked them in halves. He stood there in the laundry room, unfolding them one by one, dropping them on the floor, and then refolding them the right way. "They go this way," he said. It was a calm gesture, but it wasn't about the towels. It was about the training. It was about making sure I knew that every single part of my life, down to the way I tucked a piece of fabric, was subject to his approval. "You'll learn," he added, without looking at me. "And what do you say to that?" You nod. You become smaller. You become so attentive to the world around you that you can hear the sound of his keys in the lock from a block away. You become a world-class expert in micro-expressions. You study the way his jaw tightens. You measure the length of the pauses between his words. You learn that a sigh that lasts half a second too long means you've done something misaligned. My body started reacting before my brain could even process what was happening. Whenever I heard his footsteps, that copper taste would appear in my mouth. Metal. Always metal. Then came the day of the plate. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was beating down on the roof, making the house feel like an oven. I was washing the dishes, my mind drifting off to some imaginary version of my life where I was walking down a street in a big city, wearing shoes that didn't have red dust on them. My hands were soapy, and the ceramic plate, one of the good ones he liked, just slipped. It hit the tile floor and shattered into 1,000 jagged white teeth. The sound was violent. It echoed through the kitchen like a scream. I froze. I didn't even breathe. I stood there staring at the mess, and I could actually hear my heart slamming against my ribs. Thud, 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 thud. I heard his footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He walked into the kitchen and didn't say a word. He just looked at the floor. Then he looked at me. The silence was heavier than any shouting match I'd ever had with my father. It was a weight that pulled the air right out of my lungs. "I'll clean it," I said, my voice cracking. I scrambled to the floor, kneeling among the shards. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely function. A piece of the plate sliced right through my index finger. I didn't even feel the pain at first. I just watched the thin line of red blood bead up on the surface of my skin. And there it was, the taste of metal. It was stronger than ever now, mixed with the actual smell of blood. He didn't get angry. He didn't tell me I was clumsy. He just handed me a cloth, his face totally expressionless. "Be more careful," he said. "Mistakes are for people who don't pay attention." He spoke to me like I was a child, like I was a student who had failed a test. And as I wiped the blood off my finger, something inside me shifted. It wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was something deeper. It was awareness. I realized that I wasn't just living my life anymore. I was reacting to the possibility of what might happen. I was living in a future that hadn't occurred yet, constantly trying to prevent a disapproval that was always lurking around the corner. Fear had moved into the house. It had unpacked its bags, hung up its coat, and was now rearranging the furniture inside my chest. And the most dangerous part of all, from the outside, everything looked perfect. To the people in the town, we were a respectable couple. They saw the house, they saw the cattle, and they saw a wife who stood straight and spoke softly. They congratulated us on our discipline. They told my father he had done a great job finding me such a solid man. They mistook my rigidity for strength. They mistook my silence for peace. But silence can only stay quiet for so long before it starts to ferment. It starts to grow teeth of its own. One evening, about 4 months into this peaceful life, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The sun was setting, casting a long, bruised purple shadow across the tiles. I looked at the woman in the glass, and for a second, I didn't recognize her. She stood differently. Her shoulders were pulled back, but not with confidence, with tension. Her eyes didn't look like Maria's eyes anymore. They were scanning the room, even when no one else was there. She was looking for a misplaced towel. She was looking for a grain of dust. She was practicing her stable face. I realized I was living in a state of hypervigilance. I had become a ghost who was obsessed with the world of the living. I leaned in close to the mirror until my breath fogged up the glass. And then, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do since the night of the announcement at my father's table. I spoke the truth out loud. "I'm afraid," I whispered. The word felt like a physical object in the small, tiled room. It didn't disappear. It hung there, in the air, defiant and real. And for the first time, I didn't swallow it. I didn't force it down into my stomach to be digested by the metal taste. I let it exist. Fear had a taste. It had a smell. And now, it had a voice. I stood there for a long time, watching the fog on the mirror slowly disappear. I realized that acknowledging the fear was the most dangerous thing I could do. Because once you acknowledge that you're afraid, you have to ask yourself why. And once you ask why, you have to decide if you're willing to live like that for the next 50 years. I thought about the red earth of the Sertao. I thought about the wind that steals secrets. And I thought about the girl who wanted to be an icon. The girl who sang into a broomstick and believed she was a star. She was still there, buried under the structure and the order. She was screaming under the floorboards of my soul. I learned what fear tastes like. It tastes like metal and silence. But I also learned something else that night. Something that Manuel and my father and the whole town didn't know. Silence, when you stretch it too far, doesn't just stay quiet. It begins to crack. And cracks are the only way the light can get back in. I wasn't ready to run. I didn't have a plan. I was still the proper young woman of respect in the eyes of the world. But as I walked out of that bathroom and back into the ordered, disciplined silence of our bedroom, I knew one thing for sure. The Star of Europe wasn't dead. She was just waiting for the lights to go out so she could find the exit. Fear had become my familiar. It was my shadow. But familiarity is the very first step toward questioning the way things are. And once you start questioning, the cage starts to feel a lot less like a home and a lot more like a target. I closed my eyes and counted. 1, 2, 3. But I didn't stop at 30. I kept going, because my story wasn't going to end with a number someone else picked for me. My name is Mariah. Mariah from Brazil. And I was finally starting to realize that the metal in my mouth wasn't just fear. It was the bit between my teeth. And if I was ever going to be free, I was going to have to learn how to bite back.